Howdy, folks. If you were watching the last episode, I apologize for that quick cut. I ran out of video space on my phone. Sorry, I forgot to delete a few videos from the previous episodes. Just, I guess part of the learning curve here on YouTube. Promise it won't happen again. So please subscribe for a flawless video in the future. So basically we were just in the middle of chapter 34. I was going to do a longer session this time. Elizabeth and Darcy are in the middle of fighting right now, so let's hear what they have to say. He professed his love for her, and then she's like, "You suck, you're such a dick, you ruined my sister's happiness, and you think you're better than everyone." He's like, "I do think I'm better than everyone, and I did ruin your sister's happiness, and I'm happy about it. I also still love you, so what do you say?" And so she's like kicking him in the face and stuff. Anyways, Elizabeth felt herself growing more angry every moment. Yet, as Darcy backed her against a wall, she tried to the utmost to speak with composure when she said, "You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any other way than as it spared the slightest grief which I might have felt in beheading you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner." She saw him start at this, but he said nothing, and she continued, "You could not have made the offer at your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it." Again his astonishment was obvious, and he looked at her with an expression of mingled incredulity and mortification. She went on. "From the very beginning, from the first moment, I may almost say, of my acquaintance with you, your manners, impressing me with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others, were such as to form the groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable a dislike, and I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry." So, burn. "You have said quite enough, madame. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness." And with these words, he hastily left the room, throwing the poker into the fire as he did. The fire poker, the hot fire poker. She had it, he had it. Anyways, as he did, and Elizabeth heard him in the next moment open the front door and quit the house. The tumult of her mind was now painfully great. She knew not how to support herself, and from the feminine weakness which she had so struggled to exorcise from her nature, sat down and cried for half an hour. I don't think it's weak to cry. Personally, cry away. Her astonishment as she reflected on what had passed was increased by every review of it. That she should have received an offer of marriage from Mr. Darcy, that she should fail to kill him when her honor demanded it, that he should have been in love with her for so many months, so much in love as to wish to marry her in spite of all the objections which had made him prevent his friends marrying her sister, and which must appear at least with equal force in his own case, was almost incredible. It was gratifying to have inspired unconsciously so strong an affection, but his pride, his abominable pride, his shameless avowal of what he had done with respect to Jane, his unpardonable assurance in acknowledging, though he could not justify it, and the unfeeling manner in which he had mentioned Mr. Wickham, his cruelty towards whom he had not attempted to deny, soon overcame the pity which the considered of his attachment had for a moment excited. That is a long sentence. That's like a lot of commas and a lot of different things being involved in one sentence. I'm trying to keep the flow because it's no periods or anything, and some of it's just like a breath, but still, not enough. She continued in a very agitated reflections till the sound of Lady Catherine's carriage made her feel how unequal she was to encounter Charlotte's observation, and hurried her away to her room. Chapter 35. Elizabeth awoke the next morning to the same thoughts and meditations which had at length closed her eyes. She could not yet recover from the surprise of what had happened. It was impossible to think of anything else, and, totally indisposed for employment, she resolved, soon after breakfast, to indulge herself in vigorous exercise. She was proceeding directly to her favorite walk when the recollection of Mr. Darcy's sometimes coming there stopped her, and instead of entering the park, she turned up the lane which led her farther from the turnpike road. After walking 2 or 3 times along that part of the lane, she was tempted, by the pleasantness of the morning, to stop at the gates and look into the park. The 5 weeks which she had now passed in Kent had made a great difference in the country, and every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and fearful of its being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating. Did he mean to strike her down? How could she have been so stupid as to leave the parsonage without her katana? With superior quickness of foot, Darcy was able to cut off her retreat at the gate, and, holding out a letter, which she instinctively took, said, with a look of haughty composure, "I have been walking in the grove some time in hoping of meeting you. Will you do me the honor of reading that letter?" And then, with a slight bow, turned again into the plantation and was soon out of sight. Oh, it's like a love letter or something. Breakup letter. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter, and, to her still increasing wonder, perceived an envelope containing 2 sheets of letter paper, written quite through, in a very close hand. I have to read all this? Pursuing her way along the lane, she then began it. It was dated from Rosings at 8 o'clock in the morning, and was as follows. He dated it and time-stamped it? That's funny. "Be not alarmed, madame, on receiving this letter, by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments or renewal of those offers which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you, or humbling myself, by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten. 2 offences of a very different nature, and by no means of equal magnitude, you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was, that regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other, that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honour and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. If, in the explanation of my actions and motives, I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours, I can only say that I am sorry. The necessity must be obeyed, and further apology would be absurd." Look at this letter. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages. Long letter, dude. All right, strap in, everybody. Here we go. Mr. Darcy, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country. But it was not till she took ill and remained at Netherfield that I had any apprehension for knowing of her occupation as a slayer of the undead. I was certain that she had been stricken with the strange plague. Not wishing to trouble you or any of the Netherfield party with my theory, I endeavoured to smother Bingley's affections, thus sparing him the agony of watching your sister succumb. Upon her recovery, which I expected to be temporary, I perceived that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I have ever witnessed in him. Your sister and I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but I remained convinced that she would soon begin the cheerless descent into Satan's services. As the weeks turned into months, I began to question my observations. Why had she not yet turned? Could I have been so wrong as to mistake a simple fever for the strange plague? By the time I realized my error, it was too late to effect any undoing of the scheme. Mr. Bingley had been quite separated from Miss Bennet, both in distance and affection. Though I did so without malice, my actions have surely pained your sister, and your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that the severity of your sister's cold was such as might have given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was plagued to darkness. That I was desirous of believing her stricken is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigation and decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes or fears. I do not believe her to be afflicted because I wished for it. I believed it on impartial conviction, as truly as I wished it in reason. Lost my place. But there were other causes of repugnance. These causes must be stated, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently betrayed by herself, your 3 younger sisters, and even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you, but amidst your concerns for the defects of your nearest relations, let it give you consolation to consider that you and your elder sisters are held in my highest esteem, both in manners and skill as fellow warriors. I will only say farther that from what passed that evening, that my opinion of Miss Bennet being stricken was confirmed by her failure to join us in the investigation of the unfortunate kitchen incident, and my will strengthened to preserve my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. His sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own, though for different reasons. Our coincidence of feeling was soon discovered, and alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother. We shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friend the certain evils of such a choice. I described and enforced them earnestly, but however their remonstrance might have staggered or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage, had it not been seconded by my assurances of your sister's indifference. He had before believed her to return his affection with sincere, if not equal, regard, but Bingley had great natural modesty, with a strong dependence on my judgment on his own. To convince him, therefore, that he had deceived himself was no very difficult point. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire when that conviction had been given was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. There is but one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town.
Man, this doesn't sound like a good letter. This guy's just like going on about how, yeah, he did what you say he did, and I'm not that sorry for it.
Still kind of rude, if you ask me. Don't care what you have to say, I knew it myself, as it was known to Miss Bingley, but her brother is even yet ignorant of it. That they might have met without ill consequence is perhaps probable, but his regard did not appear to me enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, this disguise, was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was done only as a consequence of affection for my friend, and the belief that Miss Bennet had been cursed to wander the earth in search of brains. What a dick. With respect to that other, more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me of, I am ignorant, but of the truth of what I shall relate, I can summon more than one witness of undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man, who had for many years the management of all the Pemberley estates, and whose good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him, and on George Wickham, who was his godson, his kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Kyoto, most important assistance, as his own father was always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a proper oriental education. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, whose manner were always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of his fighting skill, and hoping the deadly arts would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his benefactor, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have, the older Mr. Darcy. During one such moment, Mr. Wickham happily boasted of his intention to practice his roundhouse kicks on our deaf stable boy, in the hopes that a broken neck would serve as punishment for a saddle polishing that hadn't met with his approval. My affection for the wretched servant required that I shatter both of Mr. Wickham's leg, lest he be able to carry out his dastardly plan. Here again I shall give you pain. To what degree you can only tell. But whatever be the sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me to promote his advancement in the battle against the Manky Dreadfuls. There was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year of these events Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that he had some intention of studying advanced musketry, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede his proposal and arrange for him to receive £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite him to Pemberley, or admit his society in town. In town I believe he chiefly lived, but his studying musketry was a mere pretense, and being now free from all restraint, his life was one of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him, but on the termination of the funds which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter. His circumstances, he assured me, were exceedingly bad. He had found musketry a most unprofitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on entering the priesthood, if I would present him with a yearly allowance. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with this entreaty, or for resisting every repetition to it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to himself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived I know not, but last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. It got dark out quick. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than present should induce me to unfold to any human being. Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago she was taken from school, and an establishment formed for her in London, and last summer she went with the lady who presided over it, Mrs. Young, to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design, for there proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Mrs. Young, in whose character were most unhappily deceived, and by her connivance and aid he recommended himself to Georgina, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love, and to consent to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement, and then Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure, but my honor demanded a duel with Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately. Mrs. Young was, of course, savagely beaten in front of the other household staff. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is £30,000, but I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, madame, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together. If you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me henceforth of cruelties towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood he had imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at. Ignorant as you previously were of everything concerning either, detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all this was not told to you last night, but as I was not then master enough of myself to know what could be revealed, For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more particularly to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who, from our near relationship and constant intimacy, and still more, as one of the executors of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. If your abhorrence of me should make my assertions valueless, you cannot be prevented by the same cause of confiding in my cousin, and that there may be the possibility of consulting him. I shall endeavor to find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands in the course of the morning. May God bless you and save England from her present unhappiness. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Chapter 36. Wow. Well, that was a lot from Mr. Darcy there. So it turns out what we heard from Wickham earlier about him breaking his legs, yes, was true, but it turns out it was kind of Wickham's own fault for threatening Darcy's friend, the stable boy. I mean, I'm guessing they were kind of young too, like teens or whatever, so, yeah, it's probably just an empty threat. But nonetheless, yeah. And as for the sister thing, still not impressed. Just because you thought she was a zombie? I mean, fuck, man. It's not your place. Stay out of it, Don't cause the drama. But yeah, how long is the next one? I mean, you guys want to just keep going? Might as well. Right? Yeah, we could get through a few more chapters and then maybe be like... Yeah. Because if I can be like 100 pages away on Saturday and Sunday, and Halloween is on Sunday, I think that'll be good. Anyways, chapter 36. If Elizabeth, when Mr. Darcy gave her the letter, did not expect it to contain a renewal of his offers, she had formed no expectation at all of its contents. She read with an eagerness which hardly left her power of comprehension, and from impatience of knowing what the next sentence might bring, was incapable of attending to the sense of the one before her eyes. His belief of her sister's being stricken she instantly resolved to be false, and his account of the real, the worst objections to the match, made her too angry to have any wish of doing him justice. But when the subject was succeeded by his account of Mr. Wickham, when she read with somewhat clearer attention a relation of events of which, if true, must overthrow every cherished opinion of his worth, and which bore so alarmingly an affinity to his own history of himself, her feelings were yet more acutely painful and more difficult of definition. Astonishment, apprehension, and even horror oppressed her. She wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false! This cannot be! This must be the grossest falsehood!" In this perturbed state of mind, with thoughts that could rest on nothing, she walked on, but it would not do. In half a minute the letter was unfolded again, and collecting herself as well as she could, she again began the mortifying perusal of all that related to Wickham, and commanded herself so far as to examine the meaning of every sentence. The account of his connection with the Pemberley family was exactly what he had related himself, and the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy, though she had not before known its extent, agreed equally well with his own words. But the thought of so punishing a deaf stable-boy, and for such a trifling offence! It was almost impossible to believe a man of Wickham's countenance capable of such cruelty. It was impossible not to feel that there was a gross duplicity on one side or the other, and, for a few moments, she flattered herself that her wishes did not err. But, when she read and reread with the closest attention the particulars immediately following of Wickham's resigning all of the elder Darcy's hopes that he would continue his training, of his receiving in lieu so considerable a sum as £3,000, again she was forced to hesitate. She put down the letter, weighed every circumstance with what she meant to be impartiality, deliberated on the probability of each statement, but with little success. On both sides it was only assertion. Again she read on, but every line proved more clearly that the affair, which she had believed it impossible that any contrivance could so represent as to render Mr. Darcy's conduct in it less than infamous, was capable of a turn which must make him entirely blameless throughout the whole. I mean, not entirely blameless, he broke the guy's legs, but I mean, I get that she's seeing him in a different light now. That's, she didn't know his story, so she was completely judging him based on the hearsay of what other people said. Obviously, that's going to skew her opinion, even if she, decides to, form her opinion in a most respectable way, knowing that she doesn't know everything. She still hated him. She still judged him completely. And now hearing this, hearing his side, she's finally like, oh, hey, maybe he's not as bad as I thought. Quick to judge. Of Wickham's former way of life, nothing had been known in Hertfordshire, but what he told himself, as to his real character, had information been hit. Oh boy. As to his real character, had information been in her power, she had never felt a wish of inquiring. His voice and manner had established him at once in the possession of every virtue. She tried to recollect some instance of goodness, some distinguishing trait of integrity or benevolence, that might rescue him from the attacks of Mr. Darcy, or at least, by the predominance of virtue, atone for what Mr. Darcy had described as the idleness and vice of many years' continuance. But no such recollection befriended her. She perfectly remembered everything that had passed in conversation between Wickham and herself in the first evening at Mr. Phillips's. Many of his expressions were still fresh in her memory. She was now struck with the impropriety of such communications to a stranger, and wondered if it had escaped her before. She saw the indelicacy of putting himself forward as he had done, and the inconsistency of his professions with his conduct. She remembered that he had boasted of having no fear of seeing Mr. Darcy, that Mr. Darcy might leave the country, but that he should stand his ground, yet he had avoided the Netherfield ball the very next week. She remembered also that, till the Netherfield family had quitted the country, he told his story to no one only but herself. But then after their removal it had been everywhere discussed, that he had then no reserves, no scruples in sinking Mr. Darcy's character, though he had assured her that respect for the father would always prevent his exposing their son. Sounds like she's having a beautiful mind moment where it's all like making sense in her head, and she's like having flashbacks like, he wasn't the greatest man I thought after all. How differently did everything now appear in which he was concerned. His behavior to herself could now not have been so tolerable. His behavior to herself could now have had no tolerable motive. He had either been deceived with no regard to her fortune, or had been gratifying his vanity by encouraging the preference which she believed she had almost incautiously shown. Every lingering struggle in his favour grew fainter and fainter, and in farther justification of Mr. Darcy, Jane had long ago asserted his blamelessness in the Wickham affair. That proud and repulsive as his manners were, as were his manners, she had never, in the whole course of their acquaintance, seen anything that betrayed him to be unprincipled or unjust. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, and absurd. Had she her dagger, Elizabeth would have dropped to her knees and administered the 7 cuts of dishonour without a moment's hesitation. How despicable I have acted, she cried. I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on the mastery of mind and body, who have often disdained the generosity of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless mistrust. How humiliating in this discovery! Oh, were my masters here to bloody my back with wet bamboo. Wet bamboo. Wow, she's glutton for punishment. From herself to Jane, from Jane to Bingley, her thoughts were in line with which soon brought her to recollection that Mr. Darcy's explanation there had appeared very insufficient when she read it again. Wildly different was the effect of the second perusal. How could she deny that credit to his assertions in one instance which she had been obliged to give in the other? He declared himself to be suspicious of her sister's being stricken, and she could not deny the justice of this wariness. For Jane's cold had been severe indeed, and even Elizabeth had once or twice suspected the same. It's true. When she came to that part of the letter in which her family were mentioned in terms of such mortifying yet merited reproach, her sense of shame was severe. The compliment to herself and her sisters was not unfelt. It soothed, but it could not console her for the contempt which had thus been self-attracted by the rest of her family, as she considered that Jane's disappointment had in fact been the work of her nearest relations, and reflected how materially the credit of both must be hurt by such impropriety of conduct, she felt depressed beyond anything she had ever known before. After wandering along the lane for 2 hours, giving way to every variety of thought, reconsidering events, determining probabilities, and reconciling herself as well as she could to a change so sudden and so important, fatigue and recollection of her long absence made her at length return home, and she entered the house with the wish of appearing cheerful as usual, and the resolution of repressing such reflections as must make her unfit for conversation. She was immediately told that the two gentlemen from Rosings had each called during her absence. Mr. Darcy only a few minutes to take leave, but that Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them for at least an hour, hoping for her return, and almost resolving to walk after her till she could be found. Elizabeth could but just affect concern in missing him, but really rejoiced at it. Colonel Fitzwilliam was no longer an object. She could think of only her letter. And that's going to be chapter 37. I'm going to pause it there, upload this one, and maybe read some more today. Yeah, why not? I can get to... really not that far. I could get... yeah. I could probably get there. Anyways, you're just watching me look at pages now. Thank you so much for joining me. Sorry about that pause, if you remember it. I don't know if you did. It was in the beginning of the video. So this is now a two-parter for this one little bit. Anyways. Yeah, hopefully we get to see more zombies soon. There's less zombies than I thought in this book, but you know, the drama is still there with the tea about Mr. Darcy, the truth on Mr. Darcy, you know. All revealed in that letter. Interesting enough, hey? My mind is reeling just as much as Elizabeth, I think. Like, yeah. Anyways, thank you so much. Please subscribe. Join me for more. My name is Mars. Catch you in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye.